Sometimes the most powerful reunions happen not with grand speeches or medals, but in the still silence between heartbeats, where memory lives and loyalty never dies. When a quiet man stepped off a bus into a forgotten desert town, no one knew they were about to witness a miracle. A soldier long presumed forgotten, a tourist trained to forget. But when fate brought them face to face at the edge of a war memorial, it wasn't orders that spoke, it was love. And in that single trembling moment, a decorated veteran and his long-lost canine partner reminded an entire nation that some bonds aren't forged by command. They're born in the fire of brotherhood, and no rulebook can tear them apart. What began as suspicion became a national outcry, and what nearly ended in silence became a story of hope, memory, and a second chance. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes walk on four legs and wait a lifetime to come home. The order rang out, sharp, cold, final. K9 engaged, take him down now, Kim. It cracked the quiet like a rifle's report. In a single heartbeat, the dog lunged. Power, purpose, muscle, not hesitation. It had been trained to act, not to ask. It didn't know the man standing motionless beneath the bleached marble of the war memorial, bathed in desert sun. It didn't care. But then a voice, barely more than a breath, soft and cracked with age. Ranger, easy now. The command didn't come from the present. It drifted from another lifetime, and it hit the dog like thunder. Mid-stride, the animal froze. Its ears twitched, its eyes darted. Recognition sparked, not in its mind, but in something deeper. Muscle memory, soul memory. Then, without warning, it crumbled. The hunter became something else. Its tail lowered. It whimpered, crept across the ground on trembling legs, toward the man who'd called its name, not with force, but with something far more powerful. Familiarity, family, and in that single moment, something long buried cracked wide open. A name the country had once shouted with honor, then forgotten, began to stir again in silence. The sun rose over Mesa Hollow without ceremony. No trumpets, no noise. Just light spilling across broken pavement and long-faded paint. Shadows stretched over the one road that cut through the town like an old scar. Few maps still bothered marking Mesa Hollow. Fewer people visited. The buildings were tired. A single gas station clung to life with one working pump. The diner opened not for business, but out of muscle memory. So no one noticed the man stepping off the early bus. He didn't announce himself. He didn't have to. Joe Barrett carried history in every quiet step, a man whose past had never been recorded in parades or headlines, only in silence. He walked with the weight of someone who had broken and healed more times than could be counted. Boots sand smooth from decades in arid terrain, an olive drab jacket that still held the outline of patches now removed. No insignia, no name, just wear and time. He hadn't come back for talk. He came for memory. 30 years. That's how long it had been since Joe last stood in this town, since the day they pulled the remnants of his unit from the canyons east of the valley, what was left of them, anyway. The operation had never been acknowledged. A ghost mission. That day had cost Joe more than a brother in arms. It had taken Ranger, his canine partner. Officially, the dog was lost. Unofficially, Joe had buried the truth so deeply inside himself that for years he nearly believed it hadn't happened. Nearly. He walked past the old diner where he and Captain High used to trade jabs and laughter after long drills. Ranger had always waited at the door, alert, patient, loyal. Now the diner looked forgotten. The sign faded, the windows dull with dust, but it was still standing, like his memories, like the pain in his knees. Joe kept walking. To the edge of town where a single monument reached skyward, a weather-worn obelisk carved with names few still read. No flowers, no flags, just granite and grief. He didn't expect an audience, didn't want one. There were no speeches, no folded flags, only Joe and the wind and a silence too heavy for words. He didn't come looking for closure. That was for people who believed such things were possible. Joe knew better. Some wounds don't close. They morph. They settle into your bones. He came because he made a promise. And Joe Barrett was a man who kept his promises, even when the world had long forgotten he existed. But what no one in Mesa Hollow knew What they couldn't see was that Joe hadn't come just to honor fallen names. He had returned to the very ground where Ranger had been torn from him, where a loyalty deeper than orders had been tested, where fate had taken something he never found again. No one knew, not the VA, not the old neighbor who waved every Friday in Arizona. Joe just boarded the bus with one worn bag, one folded photograph, edges frayed by time, tucked into the side pocket, and one slender hope, so fragile he didn't dare speak it aloud, that maybe, just maybe, standing again in this place would bring a moment of peace, or quiet, or anything. But Mesa Hollow wasn't ready, and neither was Joe. By late morning, the desert heat had begun to shimmer across the road, mirage-like. The town looked unchanged, suspicious of anything new. Old men outside the hardware store nursed chipped mugs and repeated conversations like they'd been rehearsing them for decades. They didn't know what had returned to town. They didn't know that the past had just stepped off a bus, and it was about to remind them of everything they'd forgotten. The talk that morning had revolved around the usual: weather, crop prices, and which side of town still had functioning air conditioning. But when they saw him, really saw him, everything changed. The man by the war memorial had been standing there for nearly an hour, unmoving. Joe Barrett's spine was straight, his arms relaxed at his sides, eyes fixed on the etched names of the fallen. From a distance, he resembled a soldier on watch, or maybe even a statue. His stillness wasn't casual, it carried weight. And in a town where everyone knew each other's business, and even the smallest change stirred curiosity, a lone stranger frozen in front of the memorial felt like something else entirely. Something that didn't sit right. Mabel Denning, who had owned the Mesa Hollow Diner for over 30 years, noticed him first. She had just stepped out back to shake out the bread baskets when her eyes locked onto the figure down the block. Her breath caught, not in fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. That posture, that unwavering gaze toward the stone, reminded her so painfully of her son, Daniel. Her boy who had gone off to the Gulf War and never came back. For a fleeting second, a pang of sympathy flickered in her chest. But then her gaze dropped to his jacket. Military style, worn and too deliberate. The heavy boots, the way his head turned slowly, methodically, scanning the distance like he was still on patrol. There was something about him that didn't fit. Not dangerous, but not quite right. Like a jigsaw piece shoved into the wrong place in the puzzle. And in Mesa Hollow, not right was more than enough to raise red flags. She went back inside, wiping her hands on her apron, then moved with quiet urgency to the rotary phone mounted on the wall near the cash register. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the direct line to the sheriff. "Sheriff's office," answered a familiar voice. "Mitch, it's Mabel," she said, her voice low and steady but edged with unease. "There's a man standing out by the memorial. I don't know who he is, but he's been there for a while. Just standing. Watching. Something's not right." 10 minutes later, Deputy Lane Miller rolled up in his patrol car, still dust-streaked from the dirt roads. He was new to the force, young and proud of the clean badge pinned to his chest. His movements were sharp, trained, almost too precise. As he stepped out, his mirrored sunglasses caught the midday sun, casting a flash across the street as he approached. Joe didn't move, didn't flinch. "Sir," Miller called, his tone calm but clipped. "Can I help you with something?" No response. Joe's eyes stayed on the stone, his breathing calm and even. "I said, sir," Miller repeated, his hand shifting closer to the holster at his waist. Joe's voice broke the silence, dry but not threatening. "Just paying respects." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Do you have ID on you?" Joe finally turned. His face was expressionless. No defiance, no fear, just calm. "Don't need ID to remember the dead." It wasn't the answer Miller was looking for. Not hostile, but not in line with protocol. And in a town that lived by its own unspoken script, any deviation from it set things off balance. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the station," Miller said, his shoulders squaring. "We'll get everything sorted out there." Joe didn't step forward, didn't protest, but he didn't move either. "I'm not breaking any laws," he said. "This is public property. I'm just standing here." Miller's jaw tightened. This wasn't covered in training. Polite resistance, calm, immovable. It was the kind of situation that didn't escalate on its own, but neither could it be resolved with a checklist. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Miller. I've got a possible 1066. Requesting backup. Bring the K9 unit just in case." The radio crackled, then went silent again. Joe turned his eyes back to the memorial. He didn't sigh. He didn't mutter. But something flickered behind his eyes. A flicker of sorrow. Maybe even resignation. He had come in peace. But now it wasn't just the ghosts carved into the granite who were watching him. Sheriff Mitchell Brody stood in the doorway of the station, squinting into the harsh sunlight. The call from Miller had shaken something loose in his gut. The young deputy wasn't one to ask for backup unless he really needed it, let alone call for a K9 unit. Mitch hung up the receiver, pulled his hat low, and stepped outside. Something about the town felt too quiet now, the kind of quiet that held his breath. As his cruiser turned down Main Street, Mabel stood on the diner's front porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just gave the sheriff a slow, almost solemn nod. Brody followed the woman's gaze toward the war memorial. There he was, still standing, still silent. The man hadn't even looked up as the sheriff's car approached. Brody pulled the vehicle to a stop and stepped out, slow and deliberate. One hand hovered casually near his belt, close enough to his holster to send a message, but not so near as to provoke. He was older than Deputy Miller, slower in body but sharper in the kind of way only years of weariness and long-forgotten wars could shape a man. "Sir," Brody called out, his voice steady, firm, the kind that didn't ask, it expected. "You're making folks uneasy. We'd appreciate it if you'd come with us and answer a few questions." Joe Barrett didn't move, didn't blink. His voice, when it came, was even, calm. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, as if stating a simple fact, not defending himself. "I'm here to remember. That's all." Brody studied him with the eye of someone who had long since learned to read men by more than words. The man's boots were worn but polished. His jacket, heavy, military, sat comfortably on broad shoulders, and his face, carved from something too solid for bluffing, radiated a calm that didn't come from peace but from surviving storms. Still, the moment had swelled, stretching wide and pulling others into its gravity. People began to gather. Mabel, always the first to know something was happening, had stepped out of her diner, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The twins from the gas station stood across the street, leaning against their truck, arms crossed. And then there was the child. Lily Henderson, 6 years old, with her mother's hand in one of hers and a curiosity too big for her small frame. Chestnut braids framed her round face as she studied Joe carefully, then tugged on her mother's sleeve. Her voice was clear, innocent, and yet it rang through the thick silence like a hymn breaking through stone walls. "Mommy," she said, pointing at Joe. "He looks like the soldier in Grandpa's picture, the one with the brave dig." The murmurs around them fell away. Even Brody looked over at the girl, frowning faintly. Others followed his gaze, but the change wasn't in the crowd. It was in Joe. His face, until then a mask of immovable stone, twitched ever so slightly. Just a flicker, a small rise of the brow, the briefest flicker behind the eyes. Recognition, maybe, or a memory too old to name, but he said nothing. The radio on Brody's shoulder crackled to life. "K9 en route. ETA 3 minutes. The sheriff exhaled. He hadn't meant for it to go this far, but once these wheels were turning, it was like trying to stop a freight train with bare hands. Protocol was cold. It didn't care about history or hunches or quiet old men with secrets in their silence. "Deputy," Brody said over his shoulder, "keep the perimeter clear." From somewhere down the road came a hum that grew louder. Tires crunched over gravel as a black SUV appeared, marked with military insignia, flanked by a patrol cruiser. The SUV came to a stop and the rear door opened. Out stepped Officer Ramirez, lean, clipped, all sharp efficiency. At his side was a Belgian Malinois, muscles coiled, fur tight against his frame, eyes locked forward. His name was Ranger, a creature built for obedience, for sharp, instant violence if commanded. He held still, tail rigid, chest out, radiating pure discipline. Ramirez gave a short command, and Ranger held firm, waiting for the next word. Brody turned back to Joe. "This is your last chance, sir. We don't want this to turn into something." Still, Joe didn't move. He didn't plead, didn't argue, just cast a brief downward glance toward the dog. And in that look, something shifted, not fear, but memory. The tension rippled through the crowd, a quiet rustle of movement. Ramirez stepped forward, Ranger's ears flicked, and behind them Lily tugged at her mother again, whispering, "Mommy," she said, "I think that dog knows him too." Ramirez gave the signal. "Advance!" Ranger sprang forward, trained and precise. His paws landed soft on the dusty ground, each step driven by years of conditioning. The crowd stiffened. Someone gasped. A couple moved back. Even Brody's hand hovered near his holster, unsure. But Joe Barrett didn't retreat, didn't blink. His body didn't shift an inch. He stood as if rooted in another world, one filled with blood and mud and brotherhood long buried beneath metals and silence. Then he spoke. "Ranger," he said softly, voice barely more than breath. "Easy now." The words rolled through the summer heat, light and calm. They weren't an order. They were a memory, worn smooth by time and pain and bonds forged in places no child should ever hear about. And Ranger stopped, dead still, mid-step, legs stiff, ears flicking. Ramirez instinctively tightened the leash, ready to correct. But Ranger didn't budge. His head tilted. His gaze locked on Joe with something almost human in its hesitation. Recognition, not of a command, but of a bond, of something old. Buried beneath thousands of hours of drills, commands, and cold precision, something ancient stirred. Joe stepped forward, slow and heavy, like each footfall carried the weight of 1,000 memories. His voice was quiet but thick with something deeper than sound, grief, hope, love. "I know you hear me," he said. "It's me. It's Joe." The dog blinked, and then something cracked. Like a dam, like a shield, like a soul finally given permission to remember. A low, tentative whine escaped from deep in the dog's throat. Ramirez tensed beside him. "Hold," he ordered, sharp and instinctive. But Ranger didn't hold. He wasn't following protocol anymore. No badge, no handler's command, no rehearsed sequence of behavior could compete with the pull of something deeper, older, etched into muscle memory and heart alike. He took one unsteady step toward Joe, then another. And then, right there in the middle of a street that had known too much silence and suspicion, the dog, once a perfect symbol of control, a tool of enforcement, folded. First his front legs, then his whole body, his belly to the ground, his tail tucked tight. He whimpered like a soul finding its way home. Crawling forward in a slow, trembling motion, he reached Joe's boots and pressed his nose to the worn leather. Then he tilted his head up and gave the lightest nudge, as if waking someone from a long, hard sleep. Joe's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees like the ground had been ripped out from under him, one hand reaching forward with a disbelieving ache, like he needed to touch to believe. "Ranger," he choked out. "God, it's really you." The dog let out another sound, higher this time, urgent, impatient, then shoved his head into Joe's chest, seeking the warmth he'd carried in memory. The moment stilled the air itself. Not a breath moved, not even the desert wind. The crowd froze. Ramirez stood like stone, leash hanging useless in his limp hand. Behind him, Deputy Miller slowly lowered his sunglasses, eyes narrowing in disbelief. Sheriff Brody stepped closer, his voice low and uncertain. "Ramirez, what the hell is this?" Ramirez didn't answer. Couldn't, because there in plain sight of everyone, the most elite, most disciplined K-9 unit in Mesa Hollow had just shattered every rule it had ever known, falling not into formation, but into the arms of a man no one else had recognized. No one but Ranger. Joe pulled the dog close, both arms wrapping tight around him, burying his face into the dense fur of Ranger's neck. His shoulders shook, not from fear or shock, but from release. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "All these years." From the crowd, a little voice broke the silence. "That's the brave dog, Mommy," said Lily, clutching her mother's hand tighter. "The one from Grandpa's picture." On the porch of the diner, Mabel Denning stood with a trembling hand pressed over her chest. Her eyes gleamed with something she hadn't dared feel in so long, hope. And one by one, the people of Mesa Hollow began to understand. This wasn't a threat they'd witnessed. It wasn't a standoff. It was a reunion, a miracle. Still pressed into Joe's chest, Ranger let out a deep, contented sigh. His tail moved. Once, soft against the dirt. Then again, steadier. Joe looked up. His eyes were wet, his voice cracked wide open. They told me he died, he said to no one in particular. Said he disappeared in the chaos, but he's here. Still remembering. Sheriff Brody rubbed a hand over his face, torn between disbelief and something like reverence. Behind him stood the town's war memorial, weathered, solemn, carved into the bones of the land. Today it bore witness to something beyond duty or honor. Not a confrontation, not a capture, but the revival of a bond formed in blood, in dust, in danger, and in loyalty that had never wavered, even when everything else had. The stillness afterward hung in the air, like prayer. Ranger curled beside Joe Barrett, body relaxed at last, not as a soldier anymore, not as a trained instrument of law, but as a companion, one who had finally found his way back home. Joe said nothing. He kept one hand resting on the dog's shoulder, his fingers tracing through the familiar fur, slow and gentle, afraid this might all slip away if he let go. Then came the sound, a low, vibrating rumble that rolled across the desert road like a warning, the kind of sound that made people look before they knew why. A matte black SUV appeared on the horizon, gliding into town with the unmistakable weight of authority. Its surface absorbed light like a shadow given wheels. The license plates bore nothing but bold federal numbers. No state, no identity, just presence. The vehicle stopped. The door opened, and out stepped a tall woman in crisp military fatigues. Her boots hit the pavement like punctuation, confident, sharp, absolute. She moved with the composure of someone who had stepped into chaos many times before and made it kneel. Major Helen Davies. Her eyes scanned the scene. Citizens frozen in reverence. Lawmen stunned into silence. And at the center of it all, a man on his knees, clinging to a dog no one could explain. Not yet, but she would. Joe sat there, the dry earth warm beneath him, his arms gently wrapped around the dog he once believed was lost to war and time. His eyes, weathered by years of memory and grief, locked with those of the K9 who had once been more than just a partner. Valor, no, Ranger now, breathed steadily against Joe's side, the tension that had haunted the animal for years finally melting into calm. The once mechanical glint in his eyes had been replaced by something older, something truer. Recognition, connection, a quiet sense of home. Major Davies stood tall, eyes never leaving Joe as she stepped forward, her voice clear but carrying weight beyond protocol. Sergeant Major Joseph Barrett, she said, her tone crisp but tinged with a rare mix of reverence and something personal. Joe blinked against the glare of the midday sun, lifting his head to meet her gaze. Haven't heard that rank in years, he murmured, voice hoarse with memory. Without hesitation, Major Davies moved ahead, producing her badge and flashing it toward Sheriff Brody. The gleam of federal authority in her hand and the force of her presence shifted something invisible but palpable in the space around them. Brody instinctively stepped back, his posture softening. Sheriff, she said, her voice firm yet respectful, I understand your concerns about public safety, but this man is not a threat. He's a decorated war hero, Medal of Honor, Silver Star, 22 years in Special Operations Command. Deputy Miller's face flushed with embarrassment, his radio still limp at his side, suddenly useless. The balance had turned. Major Davies turned her attention to Officer Ramirez. That dog, is he registered as K9 Ranger, badge number 7 Bravo X-ray? Ramirez blinked, caught off guard. Yes, ma'am, we just call him Ranger now. He was reassigned after his original handler was declared MIA. Davies tapped her secure tablet. The screen came alive, lines of data streaming in strict military format. She scanned the feed quickly, then held the tablet up for verification. Cross-check confirms it, she announced. This is K9 Ranger, previously registered as Valor. He was assigned to Sergeant Major Barrett under Combat Unit Echo 17, reported lost during a Black Ops evacuation in Kandahar, an IED strike. Joe's jaw clenched as he looked down at the dog, his dog. His hand trembled slightly as it hovered near Ranger's ear. We got hit bad, he said, voice low. Last thing I saw, he was dragging one of our guys out of the wreck. I thought he I thought he didn't make it. Davies's voice softened, a note of humanity breaking through her composure. He barely did, but he was never the same with any other handler, always restless, always searching. Ramirez stepped closer now, staring at the Tug as though seeing him for the first time. I thought he was just intense, like something was missing. It was, Davies said. His partner. The crowd had fallen into a reverent hush, not out of fear anymore, but from something deeper, understanding, respect. Lily Henderson, no older than 10, whispered something to her grandfather, eyes wide. Mr. Henderson, a Vietnam vet who'd rarely spoken about his past, stood straighter, quietly placing his hand on his granddaughter's shoulder. He gave a slow, knowing nod. Mabel Denning, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron, murmured just loud enough to be heard. I knew he wasn't here to hurt anyone. That's the look of a man haunted by ghosts. Davies turned to Joe again, this time with open admiration. Sir, this reunion is going to make headlines. I've already notified command, but I needed to see it for myself. You're not just a soldier, Sergeant Major. You're a legend. And this? She nodded toward Ranger. This is the proof. Joe's smile was tired, but honest. Didn't come here for headlines, just came to say goodbye to a ghost. Davies gave a quiet smile of her own. Looks like the ghost found you first. And just like that, the weight that had loomed over Mesa Hollow lifted. The man the town feared turned out not to be a stranger at all. He was one of their own, a quiet hero whose loyalty spanned decades and losses most could never imagine. For one golden moment, the world felt still, whole. Joe remained seated by the weathered war memorial, arms around Ranger, his long-lost companion. The dog lay still, breathing evenly, finally at peace. Those sharp, obedient eyes now held warmth, clarity, and a feeling that defied time. They were no longer soldier and dog. They were home. But peace, as always, was fleeting. At a distance, Major Davies moved away from the gathering, raising a secure line to her ear. Her voice remained calm, measured. Yet, as she listened to the clipped, bureaucratic responses on the other end, her brow tightened. She spoke words that bore rank, but none of them bore heart. Behind her, the sheriff and Ramirez exchanged glances, but said nothing. No one dared break the silence thickening around her. Several minutes passed. When she returned, her steps were slower, her expression colder. She no longer looked at Joe as a fellow soldier reunited with a friend, but as someone bracing to deliver a blow he didn't deserve. Sergeant Major, she began, the warmth now gone from her tone. I've just spoken with command. They've reviewed the scan data and confirmed the... Joe nodded silently, still kneeling beside Ranger, his hand resting protectively on the dog's shoulder. And that's that, right? He's mine. We go home. His voice was low but certain, final. Davies didn't answer right away. She hesitated, and that hesitation shifted the air. The moment cracked and something heavy slipped into its place. Ranger's ears perked, sensing the shift. Joe's posture stiffened as he caught the change in her expression. I wish it were that simple, Davies finally said. Joe's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? She took a breath. Technically, Canine Ranger is still considered government property. He was never officially retired, only reassigned. That means, under current regulations, he's still classified as an active service asset. He falls under the jurisdiction of the Military Working Dog Command. Joe's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against the dog's fur. You're telling me that after everything you just saw, he's still going back into the system? Davies lowered her voice as if softening the blow might change its shape. A transport team's already been dispatched. They're en route now, should arrive within the hour. The protocol is clear. Ranger will be taken for reassessment, most likely reassigned. From the side, Ramirez stepped forward, disbelief coloring his voice. You can't be serious. That dog, he hasn't reacted like that to anyone, ever. That's his handler. That's who he's meant to be with. Davies didn't disagree. Her eyes, bright with frustration, flashed briefly. I agree, she said. But this isn't about what I think or what any of us feel. This is about rules. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Neighbors, townspeople, once merely spectators, now unmistakably invested. Mabel Denning pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Little Lily clutched her grandfather's fingers tightly, her small face creased with concern. Joe's voice cut through the building tension, clear and rising just enough to demand the air's attention. Let me get this straight. He remembered me. He disobeyed a standing command to come to me. He chose me. And you're saying you're just going to tear him away again because some outdated file says he's not mine? Davies met his gaze, her voice strained. I'm saying the military machine doesn't stop for moments like this, no matter how real they are. Joe looked down at Ranger. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just stared at Joe, eyes locked, utterly present. As far as Ranger was concerned, the decision had already been made. He wasn't leaving Joe's side again. I already lost him once, Joe said, voice raw and low. You think I'm going to stand here and watch it happen again? Davies looked as though she wanted to say something more, something human. But all she managed was, you can file an appeal, petition for adoption. There's precedent, but it takes time. Joe's eyes burned with disbelief. Time? He's waited 10 years. And now, after this, you're asking us to wait even longer? The crowd had grown quiet again, but not in awe. This silence felt different. It bristled, simmering with restrained anger and heartbreak. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his voice gravelly but clear. That dog saved his life. That bond, they forged it out there. In the dirt, under fire. That doesn't belong to the military anymore. It belongs to them. Still, Davies didn't move. I have orders, she said quietly. The extraction team is already on their way. A weight settled over the group like a fog. One by one, eyes dropped to the ground. Ramirez, who had stood defiantly only moments before, now looked away, jaw clenched. Joe rose slowly, his body tense with quiet resolve. Ranger stayed beside him, unwavering. You want to separate us again? Joe said, his voice low but steely, each word shaped with calm defiance. Then you'd better be ready to drag me away too, because this time, he won't let go without a fight. Somewhere beyond the hills, the distant thrum of helicopter blades began to stir the air. The sound grew steadily louder, beating like a warning through the open sky. The tension hung in the air like a storm on the verge of breaking. The crowd stood frozen, watching, as if caught in a moment too large to touch. Ranger remained pressed against Joe's leg, unaware of the layers of bureaucracy unraveling overhead. He didn't know about protocol or reassignment. He only knew that his handler, the one who had whispered his name during the darkest nights, was here, and he was never letting go again. Major Davies stood near the war memorial, posture rigid, her eyes locked on the horizon. The helicopter was close now. Her orders were clear, but everything about this scene, the man, the bond that refused to die, felt wrong. No, not wrong, sacred. Near the back of the crowd, Lily Henderson tugged her mother's sleeve. Mommy, did you get it? Her mother, Jenna, nodded slowly, the phone still in her hand. She hadn't meant to record anything at first, but when she saw Ranger stop mid-stride and Joe whisper his name like a prayer, something inside her had moved. Her fingers had lifted the phone and hit record, almost without thought. She had captured everything, the recognition, the pause, the collapse, the reunion, and now the video was already uploading. The caption she typed was simple, honest. He wasn't a threat, he was family. Ranger remembers what happened next spread like wildfire, only this time it was digital. In just 15 minutes, the video had already hit 5,000 views. By the time the helicopter's shadow glided over the Memorial Plaza, the count had soared past 50,000. It wasn't just a clip anymore. It was a movement. It tore across social media like a spark on dry brush. Veterans groups, military families, animal rescue advocates, and influencers from every corner of the internet reposted it. But they weren't watching just an old man clinging to a retired asset of war. They were watching a soldier reclaim a piece of his soul. They saw a dog choose love over rigid obedience. It hit a nerve, deeply. Hashtags flooded timelines. #Ranger remembers. #Bring Ranger home. Let them stay together. Public figures joined in. Celebrities, retired generals, and even military brass began tweeting and tagging the Pentagon and the Command Center for Military Working Dogs. Pressure built fast and loud. When Major Davies' comms device buzzed again, she didn't need to pick it up. One look at the screen said it all. A single message from Public Affairs flashed. Hold extraction. Full review in process. Stand down. She exhaled slowly, her body relaxing just a fraction as she turned back to the growing crowd in front of her. Her voice carried a note of something warmer this time as she called out, "Sergeant Major Barrett?" Joe looked up, puzzled. She walked toward him, crouched slightly to meet Ranger's wary eyes. The dog watched her, alert but calm. "I have new orders," she said. "You're not going anywhere, not without him." Joe's throat tightened. His jaw twitched like he wasn't sure whether to speak or just let the moment carry him. "Are you serious?" he whispered. "We're initiating emergency reassignment protocol. Effective immediately, Canine Ranger is retired from active duty and placed in your custody." A ripple of applause broke through the plaza. Mabel Denning let out the breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. Mr. Henderson offered a solemn single clap. Little Lily, beaming, looked up at her mom. "Did we help?" Jenna was crying, laughing all the same. "We helped." Joe knelt, one steady hand reaching for Ranger's collar. "You're coming home, boy." Ranger let out a quiet bark, low and soft, like he understood everything. Maybe he did. And just like that, the system didn't bend to paperwork. It bent to something deeper. The voice of a nation had spoken, not through legal memos, but through compassion, through collective memory, through shared humanity. Mesa Hollow would never be the same after that. The man they once watched with suspicion became someone else entirely, a quiet symbol of something enduring. Joe Barrett never asked for recognition. He didn't demand a ceremony. He didn't want a parade. But the town gave him something far better. Quiet respect. Each morning he returned to the memorial. This time not alone. Ranger walked beside him, not stiff, not performing, but trotting with calm loyalty. The two of them, worn, tested, resilient, became part of the landscape. People waved now. Some stopped to shake his hand. Others nodded with a humility that came from confronting their own past judgments. A few days later, under the faded awning outside the diner, Sheriff Brody walked up to Joe. He held his hat in both hands, eyes steady, voice low. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I followed the rule book, but I forgot what it means to look a veteran in the eye and see more than protocol." Joe gave a quiet nod. "We've all got our training, Sheriff. Some of us just have to unlearn it at the right time." The idea for a plaque came from Mabel Denning. She didn't announce it. She didn't rally people. She just acted. Paid for part of it herself, though she admitted the tip jar beside the register started filling with donations the moment people heard. A week later, the bronze plaque was installed. Nothing fancy, just a line beneath the engraved names of the fallen. For Joe Barrett and Ranger, bonds that never break. At the unveiling, almost the entire town came. There were no speeches, no marching bands, just stillness, reverence. Joe stood by the stone, his hand resting on Ranger's back. Lily Henderson stepped forward, holding a tiny flag. She looked up and gave Joe a shy, serious salute. He returned it. No words, just a smile that said more than language ever could. That day, Mesa Hollow learned something. About loyalty, about humility, about seeing again, really seeing, before deciding what someone's worth is. And in the quiet heart of that desert town, a bond forged in war, tested by time, and nearly lost to bureaucracy endured. Ranger didn't return to base. He returned home. The paperwork was done. Bureaucracy had run its course, and at long last, he was home. The camera crews that once swarmed Mesa Hollow slowly disappeared, their bright lights and fast-talking anchors fading into yesterday. But Joe Barrett stayed. He could have packed up, moved to a place nearer the VA hospital, faded into the background like so many others. But something about this quiet, dusty town, skeptical of him at first, had shifted. It reminded him of the places he used to protect with his unit, small, honest towns stitched together by calloused hands and hearts that still meant it when they shook yours and looked you in the eye. Every morning, Joe and Ranger made their way to the memorial. It wasn't out of habit, and it certainly wasn't for show. It was a promise, a quiet vow renewed with every step. Ranger didn't wear his service vest anymore. Now, around his neck rested a worn leather collar with the word Valor carved carefully into it, Lily Henderson's gift. A simple thing, but it meant everything. Joe didn't speak much with other adults. But when children came around, curious and full of questions, something inside him softened. He would sit with them cross-legged on the gravel near the stone monument, their eyes locked onto his, wide and eager. The stories he told weren't of battles or enemies. No, he spoke of something deeper. Teamwork, trust, the kind of courage that doesn't always happen in a war zone. Service, he'd tell them, isn't just about wearing a uniform. It's about standing for something bigger than yourself, even when nobody's watching. He would motion to Ranger, now silver around the muzzle but still alert, still noble. This boy right here, he never asked if it was too hard, too long, or too late. He just did the job, and he never, ever gave up. One day a small boy asked, "Were you ever scared?" Joe smiled, "All the time." Then he looked gently at the boy and added, "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do the right thing anyway." At moments like that, Ranger would lean in close as if remembering, and the kids would instinctively reach out, brushing their small hands through fur that once ran headfirst into fire and flying metal. Joe never called himself a hero. He didn't want the label. But in that quiet corner of the desert, where dust blew gently and memories hung heavy in the air, surrounded by children and stories that mattered, he became something more, a keeper of truth, a witness to loyalty, a living reminder that some bonds are forged not just in war, but in the stubborn, beautiful act of continuing on. As long as Ranger stayed by his side, Joe Barrett would keep showing up. One morning, one child, one conversation at a time. Not all heroes return to a nation's welcome. Some simply walk among us, weathered, uncelebrated, carrying stories too deep for most to hear. Men like Joe, dogs like Ranger. They never asked for the spotlight. They never needed it. What they deserve, what we owe them, is to be remembered. This story isn't just about a dog who remembered his partner. It's about a country learning how to see again, to stop and really notice the ones we so often walk past without a second glance. The veteran alone at the park bench, the service dog guiding quietly, the names carved in stone, fading with every year. But these stories, like Joe's, remind us loyalty doesn't vanish. It waits. It remembers. And when the time is right, it comes home. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you've lost or someone you've overlooked, leave a comment below that says, "Loyalty never dies." Let's make sure their sacrifices aren't forgotten. Let's carry their stories forward. And let's remind one another that true loyalty, whether born in battle or nurtured in silence, always finds its way back. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to know they are not forgotten.